So last week we watched a beautiful sermon named Moriah Moment, and it was by our pastor, Pastor Mullen. And this sermon was preached 2 years ago during our worship night 2019. And it was such a beautiful, powerful sermon to portray the testing of our heart, to see if we're even willing to surrender the thing that God blessed us with, to see where our trust is really. Is it really in God, or is it in ourselves and in our blessing? And we've been talking about surrender since the beginning of 2021, because we believe as a church, 2021 is a year of power, and surrender, the act of surrender, opens doors for power. And we still believe that. And the power that we'll see is not just in our personal life, but the power we'll see is also in corporately as a church. We'll see momentum as God really bless our church with power. And what we understand about surrender is not a one-time thing. Surrender is a daily act, is a daily thing. Because the truth is that it's so easy for us to pick up our surrender when we feel lonely. It's so easy for us to pick up what we already surrendered when we feel tired, when we feel weary. And because it's so easy to pick up our surrender, I think during this time, I believe there will be testings that take place after our surrender for God to see if we have truly let go. Because we can surrender without words. We can surrender without actions. But the question is, are we still holding on to what we have surrendered with our heart? And that's why today what I want to speak about is I want to speak about the testings that come after our surrender. And I believe there is one person in the Bible that displayed incredible commitment to his surrender, and that person was none other than King David. And if you don't know the backstory about King David, I just want to review it a little bit. So King Saul was the first king of Israel. King Saul was anointed king by God himself. But unfortunately, as time went on, King Saul's heart turned away from God. So God decided to anoint another person, and that person was David. David was anointed king because he was a man that was seeking after God's own heart. And even though David was anointed king, David was not yet appointed king. And we all know the story of David slaying the giant Goliath. And we all know the story of David achieving great victory on battlefield, even though King Saul was still king at that time. And he was not yet appointed. And because of David's victory, people were cheering him on the street, saying, David slayed 10,000 and Saul only 1,000. And this is where King Saul grew incredible jealousy against David. And he was so jealous of David that he actually tried to kill David on multiple occasions without reason. And because King Saul was jealous and he was trying to kill David, that forced King David to be on the run. And the thing about David is that David did nothing to offend Saul. David did nothing to hurt Saul, yet Saul was chasing after him, was trying to kill him, was persecuting him. And the thing about David was that David was anointed king, yet he was on the run, hiding in cave. He was not sitting on the throne in the palace like he was supposed to be. And how unfair was that? So King David was in an incredibly unfair circumstance. And what was interesting was that David ran away from Saul, but he never fought back to Saul. And can you imagine how hard it was to not fight back to someone who's trying to kill you? Can you imagine how hard it was for David to not just take things into his own hand? Can you imagine how hard it was for David to tell God, God, I surrender myself to your timing, to your plan. Even though you anointed me, I was not yet appointed, but I submit myself under your process. Can you imagine how hard it was for David to actually submit under God and still chased by his enemy, knowing that he could do something, yet he decided to do nothing because of his surrender. But yet, David was submitted. David was loyal to God's timing and God's plan. He was committed to his surrender. And the interesting thing was that his commitment was tested, not just once, but on multiple occasions. The first occasion we can find is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 24, 3-7. In the Bible, it says, at the place where the road passes some sheepfolds. Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. It's so interesting that it's such a coincidence that Saul and King David ended up in the same place. David was on the run in the cave hiding from Saul, but Saul actually came into the cave and he was relieving himself. So he was doing his business. He was in his most vulnerable position. And he says, "Now is your opportunity," David's men whispered to him. "Today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to deal with as you wish." So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. But then David's conscience began bothering him because he had cut Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him." So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. What a test that was. Imagine God placing you and your enemy at the same place at the same time, and you have the upper hand and you have the higher ground. It must be such a tempting thing for David to just take the opportunity and kill Saul right there. So David was facing an opportunity. David was given a chance that could free him out of his misery. If he were to take that opportunity, Saul will be dead. He and his men would actually be able to go home, and he will actually become king so he can get back to the palace. But this is what God was testing. God was testing to see, will David stay loyal to God's timing and God's plan, even if that meant his life would remain still in danger? Will David stay loyal to God's timing and God's plan, even if that meant he would still be on the run? He would still not see his promise come to pass just yet? Or will he leave that loyalty for the sake of protecting himself? As Christians, sometimes we say we're loyal to God. We're loyal to God's plan. We're loyal to God's timing. But the truth is that most of the time, we are the most loyal to ourselves. And because of how some of us grew up, because of the certain betrayals and hurt some of us experienced in the past, I believe most of us, we have guardrails set up for ourselves. We have defense system that we have set up for ourselves where we can ensure and we can do things to guarantee that our comfort is maintained, our protection is needed, our needs are met. I believe that we have guardrails set up to protect ourselves, to ensure that we can guarantee to provide for ourselves. And I believe that sometimes when God asks us to surrender certain things, certain specific things, he's actually challenging our guardrails because he is asking us to let go of that insurance. He's asking us to let go of that guarantee. So for example, if God has asked you to surrender a person, sometimes or a relationship, one of the thoughts that we have is that if I surrender this person and if I surrender this relationship, how will I now guarantee that I will not end up alone? And for some of you, when God asks you to surrender a career, one of the things that we ask ourselves is, now that I surrender this job, how can I guarantee that I can provide for my family, provide for myself? And for some of you who surrendered a blessing, kind of like Abraham who surrendered Isaac, and one of the things that we ask ourselves is, how can I guarantee that now I can see God's promise come to pass in my life? And we have this sense in human beings, we have this sense that we want to have guarantee, we want to have assurance that we will be protected, will be provided for. And what God is challenging David through this test is that David has all the power. David had all the power in his hand to guarantee his protection. David had all the power in his hand to guarantee his provision, because right there he could have just killed Saul. Because if he could have killed Saul, he guaranteed his protection, because now that there will be no other person that will persecute him, that will chase after him, that will try to assassinate him. If he could have just killed Saul, he could have provided for him, not just himself, but his men as well, because his men were hiding with him in the cave. And he was not just fighting for himself, but he was fighting for his men as well. So David could have guaranteed his protection. David could have guaranteed his provision. But what God was testing during that time was that, will David stay loyal to his timing, to his plan? Or will David stay loyal to himself, to his own protection, to his own provision? And I believe the same way God tests David is the same way that God can test our heart after our surrender. Is God will present to us opportunities where we can have that guarantee again, where we can have that assurance again, to know that we are provided, to know that we are protected. And God is testing our heart to see, will we stay loyal, stay committed to our surrender? Will we stay loyal to God's timing and plan? Or will we choose the way out? Or will we choose the easier way where we can guarantee our own needs are met? And David was just not tested once. David was tested twice, because in this test we just read, David passed the test because it says his conscience started bothering him. He felt bad that he was hurting God's anointed one. And he decided to stay integral to himself and to God, that he will not hurt God's anointed. He will allow God to continue to work. And the second occasion that he was tested was recorded in 1 Samuel 26, 7-12. It says, so David and Abishai went right into Saul's camp and found him asleep, with his spear stuck in the ground beside his head. Again, they found Saul in the most vulnerable position ever. Abner and the soldiers were lying asleep around him. God has surely handed your enemy over to you this time, Abishai whispered to David. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't need to strike twice. And it's interesting, on both occasions, there were people around David's life that advocated for this opportunity. And I feel like it's the same way in our life sometimes, to people around us. The occasions, the tests that God presents to us might seem the logical way to do it. And it's so tempting for David to just justify it and make it God's will. It's so tempting for David to say, well, God, you gave me this opportunity. He's asleep. He's in the most vulnerable position. It must be from you. But this is where David has to remember where his loyalty lies. This is where David has to remember that he surrendered to God's timing. He surrendered to God's plan. If God wanted to Saul dead, God would have done it himself. And this is David's response. No, David said, don't kill him. For who can remain innocent after attacking the Lord's anointed one? Surely the Lord will strike Saul down someday, or he will die of old age or in the battle. The Lord forbid that I should kill the one he has anointed. But take his spear and that jug of water beside his head, then let's get out of here. So David took the spear and jug of the water that were near Saul's head. So here's David's mindset. David's mindset is that if God wants me to have it, God will do it. There will be no manipulation on our part. And this is what we have to understand as well. If God wants to give us a way out, if God wants to give us that guarantee where we can provide and protect ourselves, God will do it himself. There will be no our doing. There will be no manipulation on our part. And we'll try sometimes to fabricate what God wants to give us. And this is where the loyalty test comes in. Will our loyalty to God's timing and plan be stronger than our loyalty to protect and provide for ourselves? Because if our loyalty is tested, and they're tested to be steadfast and faithful, there's nothing God will withhold from us. God is faithful to provide. God is faithful to protect. And sometimes God wants to see if we truly trust in him to give us in his timing, instead of we trying to maneuver things, manipulate things to create our own version of promise. And both times David was tested and David passed the test. So I believe that the same way David was tested on multiple occasions will be the same way that sometimes God might test us on multiple occasions after our surrender, to see if we're truly committed to our surrender, to see if we're truly loyal to God's timing and God's plan. And the question is that, it's not an easy decision to remain loyal in those moments, because you have the perfect opportunity right in front of you to get out. And I think the question we need to ask is, how do we remain loyal to God and to And how do we remain loyal to our commitment of surrender when we're presented these opportunities? And here are some things that I want us to consider in that moment of decision. The first thing I want us to consider is that your strength versus God's blessing. Your strength versus God's blessing. When we choose our own version of solution through manipulation, we have to navigate through it with our own strength. So if David would have killed Saul, yes, he would be no longer persecuted. Yes, he would no longer need to run. But remember, he will be considered a kingslayer because he killed the king, which is Saul. His reputation will be ruined. His name will be tainted. And everything that was promised to him will be held back because of his own manipulation. And that's the exact problem. When you do it, you have to sustain it. And the thing is, when we try to do it ourselves, when we try to do it our own way, sometimes we actually have this feeling of entitlement for God to bless us. But the truth is that we are not entitled to God's blessing if we decide to do things our own way. And our strength may be enough for a while to sustain our own doing. But how long can your strength sustain a God-given legacy? How long can your strength sustain it? Because a God-given legacy can only be sustained by God himself. David's kingship was a God-given legacy. He cannot sustain it. If he were to actually take that opportunity to kill Saul, he would have considered a kingslayer. He would have considered a person that stabbed the king in the back, that was not loyal to the throne. And everything that was promised to him would not actually have come to pass, even though he would have a short-term relief of freedom, of no longer being persecuted. And the truth is that when we give, we will give what we can manufacture. We'll give what our strength can encompass. But when God gives, he will give in abundance. And yes, you might have to wait a little bit longer. But yes, it's not instantaneous gratification. Yes, it's not a shortcut to your promise, to the process. But when God blesses, he will give, he will sustain, and he will multiply. And this is where we have to consider, do we want to rely on our own strength, or do we want God's blessing instead? Because if we choose our own way, if we choose to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves, to forsake that loyalty we have towards God's timing and towards God's plan, we are derailing. We are exiting the path that we are on. We are exiting the path that God has for us, and we cannot feel entitled for God to bless us. And instead, if we choose our own path, we have to sustain it with our own strength. And our strength is not enough to sustain a God-given legacy. And this is where we have to consider, are we willing to let go of God's blessing in order to have that short-term relief? Are we willing to let go of God's blessing in order to have that protection, have that guarantee of provision for ourselves? Do we choose our strength, or do we choose God's blessing? And the second thing we need to consider is, do we want short-term relief versus long-term reward? And after both time David passed the test, David actually got an opportunity to speak to Saul after he spared Saul's life. 1 Samuel 26:22, it says, "Here is your spear, O king," David replied to Saul. "Let one of your young men come over and get it. The Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal. And I refuse to kill you even when the Lord placed you in my power, for you are the Lord's anointed one. Now may the Lord value my life, even as I have valued yours today. May he rescue me from all my troubles." And what I want to highlight in this verse is when David said, the Lord gives his own reward for doing good and for being loyal. So God rewards your loyalty. God rewards your faithfulness. And in David's life, his reward was not just the throne, but his reward was God's continuous favor upon his kingship. His reward was God's continuous favor upon not just his life, but his children's life and the generation to come. It's God's blessing upon his lineage. And that moment of decision, we need to consider, do we want long-term reward or do you want short-term relief? Because you can have what you want right now. You can get rid of the process right now. You can escape that process right now. And you'll be happy and you'll be satisfied for a while. But what we need to consider is that what happens after that little while of satisfaction? What happens after that little while of happiness? Because then you are left with the fact that you were not loyal to God's time. You were not loyal to your commitment. You were not loyal to what you have committed to surrender. And is that the legacy that you want to leave behind? So we need to consider, do we want a short-term relief, a short-term feeling of freedom, a short-term feeling of, okay, I can now provide for myself. Okay, now I can protect myself. Okay, now the pressure is gone. Or do we want long-term reward, where we have God's reward upon our life, where we have God's blessing upon our life because of our loyalty, our faithfulness? And this is where we need to ask ourselves, what's the legacy that we want to leave behind? So many times we only think about the now. We don't think about the future because we can't see the future. But we need to consider the consequence of our decision, the consequence of our decision upon our future, upon our legacy. And we need to have long-term vision upon our life, because know that your surrender right now has a huge impact upon your future. Your surrender right now opens a door for huge blessing to come in your future. And God is training us right now to trust in Him. God is training us right now to stay loyal to Him despite all the circumstance, all the pressure that we may be facing. And God is testing our loyalty, because if our loyalty is tested to be faithful, there will be nothing that God will withhold from blessing us. So the second thing we need to consider in that moment of decision is, do we want short-term relief or do we want long-term reward? The last thing to consider as we face that decision, like David did, is that who will your decision benefit? Who will your decision benefit? Will your decision just benefit you, your comfort, and your convenience? Because for King David, what hung in the balance of his decision with the people of Israel? God anointed David to be king because God knew the people of Israel needed to benefit from his kingship. The people of Israel needed to benefit from his leadership. And at that moment of testing, David had to decide if he would act out of his own benefit and his own comfort, or will he stay loyal so he can benefit the people of Israel in the long term. I think just like David, there are people that are connected to our decision. We all have a purpose. We all have a calling. And the call that God gave us upon our life are always connected with people, because God's heart is with people. And it's not easy most of the time to do things God's way, because we can't see what He sees, which is the future. And I think this is where we need to remind that our decision, there are always something that hang in the balance of a decision. And most of the time, it's people's lives. It's the impact we have on the people around us. For David, it was the people of Israel. For you, it might be someone else. But we need to take into consideration in that moment decision that will we be selfish in the moment and just to benefit our own comfort, our own convenience, or will we actually think about the people that we might impact in the future? And I think the key to all of this, to pass the test that come after our surrender, is for us to become Christ followers that are actually after God's own heart. It was difficult for David to pass these tests, but David did. And I think partially because David was a man after God's own heart. He sought after what God wanted. He sought after what God desired for him. It was not about his own benefit. It was not about his own comfort, but it's all about God. He did everything according to God's glory. He did everything according to God's will, because he was seeking after God's heart. And I believe that in order some of us to be able to pass our tests that we may be facing in this season, is for us to become people who are also after God's heart, to say to God that I surrender to you everything that I have, despite the fact that I cannot guarantee my own provision, despite the fact that I cannot guarantee my own protection, despite the fact that I cannot guarantee my own needs are met. This is where we have infinite trust in God, where we don't surrender for the sake of getting something back, where we don't surrender for the sake of feeling entitled to receive certain blessings, where we actually surrender because we love God, we trust in God, because we give ourselves all away to God. And the message I want to remind us tonight is that just because we surrender does not mean our heart has surrendered. Sometimes our heart is still holding on to the things we have surrendered. And this is where God may come in and test our heart. Through these testings, God will put pressure on our life. And the pressure on our life sometimes will make us want to act out of our own understanding, act out of our own doing, so we can guarantee that we are provided for, so we can guarantee that our needs can be met. And when facing those pressure, I want us to remind ourselves that, do we really want to sustain this without our own strength, or do we actually are craving after God's blessing? Do we want this short-term relief, or do we want God's long-term reward? I want us to consider that. Who will my decision benefit? Will it just be myself, or am I taking into consideration that the people I might impact through my decision later? And I want to encourage all of us to stay strong, stay faithful in our path in this first season. I know that it's not easy. I know that the pressure of life sometimes may come. And when we face the pressure of life, sometimes we act out of emotion. We act out of reaction towards the pressure. But I want us to stay committed to our surrender, to remind ourselves that we are loyal to God's timing. We're loyal to God's plan, because God's timing and God's plan is way better than one that we can decide for ourselves. Even though right now we might think we know the best, even though right now we might think we know what's good for us, but the thing is, God can see the future. So if God can see the future, He can see your future. He can see how your future is guaranteed. So why don't we put our trust in someone who's holding our life in His hand? Why don't we put a trust in someone who's holding the whole universe in His hand? And this is where I want to remind us, like the sermon we heard last week, is that let's not trust in ourselves. Let's not trust in our own understanding. Let's not trust in our own blessing, but let's trust in God's timing, and let's trust in God's plan.